We're going to wait just a couple of more minutes as people wander their way into our digital space, and we'll begin with prayer and some orientation for the forum today. So glad you're here to be with us.
Ledley's ears were burning because he just joined the call, made himself the co-host. Must have realized I was talking about him.
I'm just trying to think of something clever to say to you, John, about, I don't know, but I haven't got it yet.
It's all right.
Well, good morning, everyone. We'll get started here with just a brief reminder about our digital forums. This forum is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube for those of you who are not able, for the members of our community who weren't able to join us today. The chat function is a great way to communicate during the first portion of the forum. And when we get to question and answers, I will let everybody, give everyone the ability to unmute themselves. If you'd like to unmute yourself to ask a question or just to say hello, perhaps. Otherwise, you can type those questions into the chat button. I think that's about it. Let's start with prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for the bright, sunny weather. We thank you for warming our hearts today. We pray for this country as we are in the process of vaccinating. We pray for those who are still sick, those who may get sick. We pray for the future, for our health, for the health of this parish. May we continue to find ways to love and support each other. We thank you for times like these to gather together and to open our hearts and our ears to know more about this world that you have put us in. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Molly, would you like to introduce our speaker today?
I am happy to introduce our speaker, though I think that for many folks in our Zoom room, John needs a little introduction. It's really great to have John back with us virtually to talk about the 2020 election. John is a professor of political science at Vanderbilt, where he studies political behavior in American politics. We were lucky to have him in our community for a while, and we are really lucky that he's willing to zoom in from the Central Time Zone this morning to talk a little bit about the 2020 election. As Joshua said, John's going to lead off with some remarks, and then we'll move into Q&A. And again, people will be welcome to either indicate in the chat that they'd like to ask a question, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your own question. You can type the question in the chat, and I can read them off to John as well. But generally, when we get to that point, I will moderate our conversation. So I will stop now, and I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you, Molly. Hey guys, it's such a pleasure to be here. I've been trying to make a joke in my head for the last 30 seconds about, like, of course you wait till after we move to Nashville to fix the plaster. But I couldn't quite put it together. We're doing great. Just to say something quickly personal. We've been here about a year and a half, and of course the pandemic's interrupted a lot of what that transition would have been like. But the kids have been doing well, and kids are pretty resilient, and so they've adjusted to life in many ways and have been in school this year, which has been a godsend, and we're grateful for that. And as I said to some folks who were here earlier on the early part of the Zoom, that Serena's just started January 1st as the Associate Rector of St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church here, which is a really great community, super healthy church. And hopefully, as soon as we get back to some degree of normalcy, we'll be able to really take advantage of that community fully. In the meantime, continue to do my political science things. And so that's what I'm going to do for you today. Molly asked me to come and talk a little bit about the 2020 election. And despite my best efforts, it appears that I'm in the process of writing a book about it. So tentatively titled The Bitter End, The Pandemic, Protest, and the Presidency. So if we can pull that off, you can purchase copies in bulk in the early part of 2022. I emphasize the bulk. So what I want to do today is just give you kind of I think an overview of some of the factors that I think are important in thinking about the election. I don't think these things were always front and center in people's minds, especially on election night itself. This is very political sciencey talk in the sense that I'm about to show you some slides, and the slides are full of graphs. I'm sorry that I can't supply anything a little more dazzling than that. Political scientists, when they talk about campaigns, are light on gossip, but high on graphs. So let me do that, and then I'll try to do this as quickly as I can so we can have more time for Q&A, and I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts and questions. So here I go. You guys should see some slides now. You should see it says the weather of the 2020 election. So let me explain why it's called the weather. This comes from a quote by a Democratic political consultant named David Shore. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. He just points out that a lot of campaigning is focused on pretty small stuff like advertising. But if you think of the campaign like a hot air balloon, the big thing you're doing is like getting blown around by the weather. And so part of understanding how the 2020 election turned out, like most presidential elections, is to figure out what the weather was. And you can see in the second paragraph, David talks about the economy and incumbency and cultural forces and stuff like that. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, the big stuff. So what I'll do to center our discussion, I guess, is try to focus on two takeaways. My father always said that sermons should have 3 points. He's a pastor as well. I didn't come up with 3 points today, I only came up with 2. So I guess we're one short of the Trinity, but no one understands the Holy Spirit anyway, so it's probably just as well. So 2 takeaways. First of all, Trump was predicted to lose, but not by a landslide. And that's based on things like the economy and other kinds of election fundamentals that I'll talk about a little bit. And I don't know how you guys felt on election night and the days thereafter, but I think a lot of Democrats were pretty disappointed, sort of imagined that Biden was going to walk away with an 8 or 9 or even 10-point victory based on the polls. It didn't happen. But I think if you were to look at these other things, the so-called fundamentals, you would have seen an outcome pretty similar to what actually happened. And then the second point, is the sort of depressing point, of course, which is the divides that continue to sort of affect the American electorate in terms of identity politics. And that was sort of a theme of the book that we wrote on the 2016 election. I wish I could say that's less of a theme in 2020, but I don't think that's the case. So let me start by thinking about the fundamentals for a minute. And I want to start with a couple things. The concept of incumbency, obviously, the incumbent running for re-election in 2020, and the concept of tenure, which is how long the president's party has held the White House. So first of all, as I think you guys are probably aware, like it's pretty hard to defeat an incumbent. When incumbents run, they win most of the time, 2/3 of the time when they run. And when incumbents don't run, the incumbent party basically has like a toss-up chance of winning. So it's significantly better to be the incumbent party when the incumbent himself, in this case, is running for re-election. Now, even more unusual, though, is the fact that of these 11 incumbent defeats, only 4 came after the party had held the White House for only 1 term. And if you go to the era after the 22nd Amendment limited the number of terms, the consecutive terms that the president can serve, there's only one other case besides Trump, and that's Jimmy Carter. So for the most part, if you were sitting in the White House and you'd been there, your party had been there only 4 years and you were running for re-election, you should win most of the time. but Trump didn't. So I think that's a pretty important thing to take account of. And it's a pretty important way to kind of calibrate people's expectations about what's, how do we interpret the election itself. In this sense, the election is a pretty unusual outcome. And from the Democrat standpoint, it's a pretty good outcome, not one that they should have expected just on the basis of these two fundamental factors. Then we get to the economy, and I'm going to argue, although I think people we can discuss, I'm going to argue that the pandemic created a pretty ambiguous economy. Politically ambiguous. I don't mean ambiguous in the sense that, the challenges the country faced, the suffering that people experienced was ambiguous. I'm not trying to minimize that in any way. Politically ambiguous in the sense that we had extraordinary economic challenges in the first part of 2020, but then a partial recovery. And the combination of those two things put us in territory that was, I think, a little bit challenging in terms of what it means for a forecast of the election itself. And there's a variety of ways to see these kind of politically ambiguous economic conditions. And now here are the graphs that I promised that you've been waiting for. So you guys may know that there's an economic statistic called the gross domestic product, which measures the overall size of the economy, and changes in gross domestic product quarter to quarter tell us like how much is the economy growing and how much is the economy shrinking. And that statistic exists, all the way back to about 1947. And most of the time the economy is growing quarter over quarter. Just during recessions it drops. And so you can see, sorry about that. I don't know if you all can see my mouse here, but there's a little dip in 2008, 2009 during the Great Recession. So what happens in 2020 is in the first quarter, there's a small dip, which reflects the sort of, sort of impending larger contraction. But when that contraction hits in the second quarter, it's massive. It's 9 percentage point drop relative to the previous quarter. So all told, now we've had a 10 percentage point drop roughly. And so, that's like unparalleled. There's been nothing like that in the history of this economic statistic. But you'll notice, of course, in the third quarter that the economy rebounded somewhat. It grew 7.5% relative to the previous quarter. So, of course, the net of that is still that we're in a hole, but nevertheless, it's not nearly the hole we were in as of, let's say, May. By the time you get to September, October, it's somewhat different. Same thing's true if we look at unemployment. The monthly unemployment rate, which of course goes up during recessions, went up, to this extraordinary number in April, 14.7%, which is again really, really just unprecedented in the history of this particular economic time series. But by October, it had dropped to about 7%, which was still, of course, above where it was prior to the pandemic. But again, at least some degree of recovery relative to the worst moments of the spring. One other economic statistic that's interesting is to think about the people's disposable incomes. And there's an economic statistic called your real disposable income per capita, which captures not just your personal income in the sense that income you earn from employment, but also income that you may get in receipts from the government. And that becomes extremely important in 2022 because there was a very sharp increase in disposable income per capita, in part because of the government's stimulus checks that supported people's incomes. And as you can see, that sort of roughly $4,500 increase in a very short amount of time is, again, a very unusual circumstance for the economy. Of course, there was a little bit of a decline after that $50,000 mark was hit, but still, it again makes it somewhat ambiguous to live in an economy in which GDP is shrinking, unemployment is growing or has increased, although it's coming down, but people's incomes on average have gotten better, although of course that doesn't describe what's true of every single person. Another way to think about this is to ask people what they think about the economy. And there is a measure of economic perceptions that dates back to the 1950s called the Index of Consumer Sentiment. And the Index of Consumer Sentiment is built on several different questions that asks about how your personal financial situation's going and how you think it's going to go in the near future. It asks you about your perception of business conditions in the country and whether you think those are going to improve in the future. It asks you, like, is this a good time to make major household purchases like a washing machine? You put all those things together into an index, and higher values mean people feel more favorably about the economy, and lower values, they feel less favorably. And when you chart that trend over time, it looks something like this. The index is not in a percentage point scale, so it goes above 100. The numbers themselves don't mean a lot in the absolute, but the relative changes over time do mean things. And what you can see here, just a couple things to note, is that, of course, in periods of recession, which I made orange here on the graph, consumer sentiment tends to decrease. That makes sense. I've also put little dots here for October of each election year, just to kind of give you a sense of where the electorate was as they're going to the polls, or preparing to go to the polls. I just want to draw your attention to what happened in 2020. There was, of course, a very sharp drop in consumer sentiment that was consistent with the drop in the economy that we all experienced. There was also, again, a little bit of a recovery as of October that I think matches the recovery that we saw. I think in absolute terms, it's just really important to point out that on average, consumer sentiment wasn't that low relative to other election years, especially to election years that were conducted during recessions like 2008, 2009. And in fact, if you take a look at that little dot at the very, very end, and you go back 2 dots to 2012, you can see that economic perceptions in 2020 were not much different than they were in 2012 when we re-elected the incumbent president. So again, I don't think that either the objective economic statistics or the subjective measures based on public opinion really tell us that the economy was so bad that we should have predicted, a massive landslide for the out party, for the Democrats in this case. Next thing we want to talk about is people's approval of the president, which, of course, if the president's running for re-election, is a crucial barometer of their likely success. And the thing that has always been true for Trump is that his approval rating doesn't move very much. And so the economic ups and downs of his first term and the pandemic itself didn't really appear to hurt Trump. If you were waiting for his approval rating to sort of, drop out the bottom, it just doesn't happen. But the problem from Trump's perspective is that he was already unpopular. What Trump needed was his approval rating to increase. And that's what did not happen during the election year. So let me show you a little bit of evidence on these points. So first of all, this idea that the economy really doesn't hurt Trump. I'll show you the relationship between the index of consumer sentiment, the measure from the last graph, and people's approval of the president in every month of every president going back to John F. Kennedy. All right, so here's what that looks like. This is what we call in the academy a scatter plot. It's kind of fun. So on the horizontal axis, that's the consumer sentiment. On the vertical axis, that's approval. Every dot is a month. So notice all the gray dots. All the gray dots are all the presidents from John F. Kennedy to George W. Bush. And there's a gray line that's dashed, and that tells you that for all those presidents, typically speaking, the higher consumer sentiment, the higher their approval rating. No surprise. Obama is the blue dots and the blue line. And the first thing you notice about Obama is that Obama's approval rating didn't actually vary much. As the economy recovered from the Great Recession and consumer sentiment increased, his approval rating never really increases in tandem. And so he was a president for whom there was much more of a disjuncture between people's economic views and views of Obama. And people said oftentimes, well, that may just reflect the fact that we're pretty polarized by party these days, and it's difficult for the president to get credit for a good economy. And so then we get to Trump, and the same thing is true. You can see there's a wide range of consumer sentiment during Trump's presidency because of a combination of the good economy in the first 3 years and the contraction caused by the pandemic. But Trump's approval rating doesn't really depend very much on the economy, much as Obama's didn't depend on it. The crucial difference between the two is the fact that the orange dots are almost always lower than the blue dots, no matter what. So Trump is less popular than he, in some sense, should be, given the state of the economy, for the first 3 years of his term, and maybe he's slightly more popular than he should be given the economic contraction that happened. But either way, he's not really experiencing much change or much difference on the basis of these ups and downs in the economy. But again, that's a problem for Trump, because he's got to do something to change his approval rating, and he's basically unable to do that. If you want to understand the sort of how chronically unpopular Trump was, it's really fun in my mind, because I had fun making this graph, to put Trump in comparison to all of these other presidents and who came into office, were elected into office in their first term. So I don't have like Lyndon Johnson here or Gerald Ford, but they were elected into office, served a first term, and what you can see is, of course, most other presidents experienced much sort of more significant ups and downs, which relates to some of the events that happened in their presidency. Trump, of course, doesn't appear to be affected by those events in terms of his approval rating. But the other thing you can notice from this is that Trump is just chronically unpopular. The percent approving minus the percent disapproving, Trump's always in negative numbers. The percent disapproving is always larger than the percent approving. And the only president that even really begins to match him, unsurprisingly, is Carter. If you want to see what Trump might have hoped for, notice like what's true for Obama. If you go to the upper left graph, right, like in the third year of his presidency, Obama was net unpopular too. His net approval rating was below 0. But what happens starting in the middle of that year, and especially in the election year, is that he got more popular. And in fact, you can see that in a lot of these graphs, that a lot of these presidents get more popular when they run for re-election, even, God bless him, Richard Nixon. So that's kind of what Trump might have hoped for. And that's what he didn't get. And so if we think of what the effect of the pandemic and the economy might be, you could say something like this. It didn't hurt Trump in the sense that his approval rating went down, but it might have hurt him in the sense that in an alternative universe, without the pandemic and without an economic contraction, a relatively healthy economy might have allowed Trump to increase his approval rating throughout the election year, much as other presidents did, and that would have put him in much better footing for getting reelected. So in some sense, there would have been perhaps like a hypothetical way in which Trump could have done better. And so the effect of the pandemic might be in making that hypothetical much less likely. So if you put these kind of different fundamentals together, like what did they forecast for the election itself? So we do this with little simple statistical models. You estimate the relationship between how presidential elections turn out and then the state of the economy and the presidential approval and some things like that. And then you say, okay, based on like the elections from 1948 to 2016, what's the relationship between outcomes and the fundamentals? And then you say, okay, given the state of the fundamentals in 2020, what would the model predict? So that's how we do these simple forecasts. And I'll just show you what the results of a few of these forecasts were. So, if you want to build a simple model that says that elections are a function of the change in gross domestic product in the first part of the election year and how popular the president is in June, and you allow the effect of those things to vary a little bit depending on whether the incumbent himself is running for re-election, since presidential approval and the economy tend to matter more when the incumbent's running as opposed to when the incumbent's not running, like in 2016. Well, Trump's share of the major party vote, which is to say Trump's share of the vote, the votes for Democrats and Republicans, would have been 46%. That's, again, like a very simple, you might even say simplistic model. You're only using information from the first part of the election year, but that's what it would have told you. If you want to take account of the fact that it tends to help a party when their party hasn't controlled the White House for very long, you take account of that tenure factor. Well, if you take the model and do that, then Trump would have done a little better, but still only 47%, because again, gross domestic product hasn't fully recovered. His approval rating is still low in the low 40s in June. So those are just two very simple models. And when you compare that to the actual outcome of the election, those models aren't too bad, actually. They do a pretty good job forecasting it. Trump does a little better, but not much better. So in a sense, I think these models help us to see that the election was going to be a little bit closer. than perhaps the polls led us to think. And as a consequence, then, you know, if the question is how is it possible that Trump could have come as close as he did in the national popular vote, you know, a little winning or losing by just a little over 4 points, then I think the answer has to do with the fact that he had a politically ambiguous economy rather than a clearly terrible economy, and the fact that even though his approval rating was low and that hurt him, but not so low that it led to landslides. All right, so that's the first part of the presentation, the takeaway. The second takeaway has to do with the identity politics piece of this. And maybe you guys may have seen statistics like this, but one thing that people noted pretty quickly was that the county level trends absolutely reflected some of what was already happening in 2016, and if anything, perhaps magnified that to some extent. And the left-hand graph here, so this is what you're doing is you're taking all the counties. You've got on the horizontal axis, what's the percent who are white and college educated, and then you're measuring the shift between 2016 and 2020. And so you see all those blue dots above that line, and you know where they're more Democratic than they were in 2016, and that's particularly true in counties that had larger numbers of white college-educated voters, like the Indianapolis suburbs. And that's really important from the standpoint of identity politics, because one of the things that really distinguishes white college-educated voters and non-college educated voters has to do with their opinions on questions that are related to and issues that are related to racial and ethnic identity, like immigration and things like that. Interestingly, and I'm happy to talk about this some more, you guys also know that in counties with larger numbers of Hispanic voters, there appear to be a pro-Republican shift. And that may not be a shift in the sense that voters change their minds. It may be a shift in the sense that with increasing turnout, different kinds of Hispanic voters voted in 2020 than voted in 2016. That's a puzzle that political scientists are probably going to work on for a while. But nevertheless, that's a little bit counterintuitive. We can talk a little bit more about that in Q&A if you'd like. I'll just point out the last graph here, the white voters without degrees. You all may remember during the campaign that people thought that Joe Biden would maybe help to attract white voters without college degrees to the party, back to the party, because he's from Scranton and he's got like working class bona fides in some way. And that didn't really happen. They were slightly more Republican than in 2016. So the divide there between white college and white non-college voters actually increased. And that's consistent with what we were seeing in the public opinion data leading into the election. There's really great evidence that this diploma divide, as it's sometimes called, is pretty long standing and really was only becoming magnified during the few years when Trump was in office. So this is to show you the difference between white voters with no college degree or white voters with a college degree in terms of their partisanship, and what you can see in the right is the shift of voters with white voters with no college degree toward the Republican Party, and what you can see on the left is, or excuse me, the left is non-college, the right is college graduates, and you'll see them shifting to the Democratic Party. So they're still reasonably heterogeneous groups. I think people sometimes lose sight of the fact that like a third of white non-college voters are still Democrats, for example, because we've all read too many stories about, you know, people sitting at diners in the Midwest and talking to reporters and stuff like that. But nevertheless, that to me is evidence that what was happening leading into the 2016 election hasn't really changed, and if anything, it's gotten worse. And one of the things that we showed in 2016 was that the divisions between white voters based on formal education had a lot to do with their attitudes about race and immigration specifically, much more than it had to do with their economic circumstances or their economic insecurity. So this is a graph from our book on 2016. And one of the things we did here is we said, well, okay, what's the relationship between education and whether you voted for Trump? And so here in the gray line is that relationship. Trump does better among people who have less than a college degree, and then you get to college graduates, and then to people with a postgraduate degree, and he starts to do significantly worse. That's the diploma divide. And then what we did is we said, okay, well, what if you just controlled for, in like a statistical model, what if you just controlled for how people viewed African Americans and undocumented immigrants? So just take account of those factors. And what that does is you can see is that basically flattens out that line, which is to say, it shows you that those factors are the most important in terms of accounting for what differentiates white voters from each other based on education and what explains their voting behavior in 2016. And there's no, I think, sign that despite having a different election environment, despite having a different Democratic candidate, that it was substantially different in 2020. All right, so the upshot I'd say is twofold, and then I'm done and happy to take questions. The one upshot is that, although I felt like the Democratic celebration in the wake of the election was pretty muted, and maybe in part because of what happened down ballot in Congress, I don't think the Democrats themselves should lose sight of the fact that what Biden and Harris pulled off was pretty important, pretty rare, and they didn't really underperform that much relative to the fundamentals, even though they quote unquote underperformed relative to what the polls led many people to expect. And I think that's sort of, I think that's just really important in terms of calibrating our feelings about what happened in 2020. But the other, of course, I think much more grim note, and you guys, I feel even weird just talking about this to a group sitting in Washington, D.C., because you saw this up close and in a way that I didn't down here in Nashville. But I don't think there's any real sense that we're making significant progress dealing with these divisions that we face in terms of questions of identity. And I don't think that, for example, the Republican Party is headed to any sort of reckoning or recalibration in terms of its own stance or its willingness to embrace Trump's stances. So I'd like to be more optimistic about this than I am, but at the moment, that's how I see it, at least. So let me stop. Return to Zoom and take questions. I see there's questions in the chat.
All right, thanks, John. So I will start by, first question in the chat is from Cindy Anderson, who asks, could you talk a bit about down ballot outcomes?
Yeah. Super disappointing from the Democrat standpoint, and unexpected. Oh, by the way, unexpected from the Republican standpoint too. I don't think Republicans knew. They were looking at the same polls. There wasn't somebody that had some magic, like, special sauce that told them the Republicans were going to gain these seats in the House, and like candidates like Susan Collins, who hadn't led in a single poll in Maine in months, were going to win like handily. I think part of the story is, I think what's likely to help explain that is that increasing turnout was not just a good thing for Democrats. The political science literature for a long time has basically said that increasing turnout is not a consistently beneficial thing for either party. It depends a lot on the community or the district, let's say, if you're thinking about the US House and the composition of that district. And there are districts in which what you might call the peripheral voters, the ones that aren't necessarily likely to show up every election year, but like can be nudged to show up in an election year where there's a lot of stimulation and people are really engaged. Those voters might, in some places, just might be Republican leaning. And so to me, that's probably the best explanation for what happened. Obviously, what happened in Georgia, made it feel better from the Democrats' point of view, and that may be a harbinger for, obviously, sort of the partisan trend in Georgia as a whole, and what it might be true going forward in future elections. It may simply be a much more competitive state than it used to be. But but that's my best sense of what the likely factor is. Although I don't have a graph, or anything that's going to nail that down.
Thanks. Next question is from Chip Somodevia, who asks, when we research and dig for information, we hope to find something new. In your looking at 2020, did you find anything that truly surprised you?
Thanks, Chip. If I'd been a really better presenter, I would have made sure that one of the photos I showed was one of yours. Anything that surprised me? So yeah, like I would say Latinos surprised me. I mean, I didn't think that you would see that shift. And there's a couple of things that might help us understand that. I mean, there's a couple things to say about that. First of all, of course, Latinos are still a Democratic constituency. And to the extent that Latino turnout goes up alongside the turnout of every other group in 2020, they help Biden win. Like states like Arizona, that's crucial. But the relative shift between 16 and 20, I think, was what was surprising to people. And interestingly, there are, that happened in all kinds of places and with all kinds of different nationality groups that we lump under this category of Latinos. So it happens with Cuban populations in Miami-Dade County. It happens with Venezuelan populations. It happens with Puerto Rican populations. It happens in the border counties of Texas, which are Mexican-American. It happens in Chicago, happens in Boston, happens in California, happens everywhere. So it's, sometimes people tell stories about Latinos like, well, if you go to the border counties, some of those Hispanic men actually work for the Border Patrol. And if you go to Florida, well, of course, they're Cubans, and so they're anti-communist, and so da-da-da-da-da. And I would say, well, if they're shifting in the same way everywhere, then maybe we should stop looking for like an explanation that's distinctive for each individual county or place and say what's going on overall, because they're all going in the same direction. So one possibility, again, is that turnout matters here too, that the group of Latinos that was mobilized to vote in 2020 was different than the group that showed up in 2016. Another possibility is, I'll put out there's a hypothesis, but I'm not sold on it at all, was that they were, to some extent, turned off by the rhetoric and activity around the George Floyd killing, defund the police, stuff like that. That's a theory that's out there. I don't see it clearly in the data that I've seen, but I've seen smart people say that they've seen it, so okay. People who really follow the Hispanic community, who are like actively working in the community in terms of mobilizing people, who are on the Democratic side, I've heard them say, we felt like the Latino voters were getting a lot of information from Republican campaigns in the media that they use, which may be distinctive to those groups in Spanish language when necessary. It was full of misinformation of various kinds. We felt frustrated that we couldn't combat it. We didn't think Biden was doing enough to combat it. So, when I think about what changes between elections, either different voters are showing up than previously, or the voters that are showing up in both elections are affected in some way that leads them to change their mind. And that's predicated on some kind of new information of some kind. So this story that folks were telling about what they were seeing on the ground in terms of what the chatter was on, social media apps or other things that were reaching Latino voters, that may be part of the story too. Or it could have to do with different issues like policing and stuff like that came to light in 2020 that were not maybe as salient as in 2016, although they were still salient then too. So I don't know, Chip, that's me like speculating like crazy. But I don't know that we have a good answer yet. And, in academic time, it takes us years to figure out things. We've really nailed like the 1968 election though. So if you have questions about that, let me know.
All right, next question is from Ana Gardano, who is curious about, she talks a lot about the white vote, particularly by education. Do you have similar statistics regarding the African-American and Hispanic vote?
Yes, I don't have them in front of me. There are there are some parallel differences among these groups. The education difference among Latinos is in the same direction as it is among whites. I don't know among African Americans off the top of my head, but you can see the same kind of similar sorts of divisions in terms of, or differences, I should say, in terms of other characteristics. So for example, people often talk about the gender gap, which is to say that whichever way you say this makes it sound like that's the group you're focusing on, but I'll just say it like this. White men and white women differ, and white men are somewhat more Republican voting and white men are somewhat more Democratic voting. That's not necessarily a function of being a woman or being a man. But that difference exists among Latinos and Blacks as well, in the same direction, by about the same amount, several percentage points. So I think that there is, I think to the extent that we think of education as a proxy, right, for different kinds of values and different kinds of political beliefs, it's going to have to some extent those beliefs, those same, you're going to see the same thing among different racial and ethnic groups. So it makes sense that education would function in a somewhat similar way. Other thing that I think might matter among Latinos in particular is that education among a group like Latinos is sometimes more strongly correlated with a sense of a racial or ethnic identity. And Democrats have always done better, even in 2016 and 2020, among Latinos who feel a stronger sense of like connection to this category of Latino, and those that are more weakly identified, which can arise for a variety of reasons, but one of which is maybe that just the length of the tenure in the country or something else. They are not as strongly Democratic. And so part of the challenge for Democrats, if they really want to expand, the Latino vote, and let's not forget that like in 2016, they assumed that they were going to get this overwhelming margin among Latino voters because of all the terrible stuff Trump had said about immigration and immigrants, and they didn't really get it. They did a little better maybe, but not a lot better. And everyone's like, the Latinos were going to be the sleeping giant that awoke in 2016, and that didn't happen. And then in 2020 goes the opposite direction, and so like what? But part of that may be explained by the fact that Democrats, to expand their appeal among Latinos, are going to have to expand their appeal with Latinos who don't really think of themselves very much as Latinos. And if that's the case, that suggests like some longer term challenges in terms of what is the, what's the ceiling for Democrats among this group.
All right, John, next question is from Joshua, who, and this is right in your wheelhouse. Should we trust the polls after the last election? If not, why are they still so consistently used to describe what Americans think about legislation, for instance?
A lot of pollsters thought we were going to fix it. I should say they, I'm not a pollster really, but thought they were going to fix it after 2016. And the things that they thought would work, I don't think there was a lot of evidence that they were going to work even in 2016 among the pollsters that tried it, and it didn't seem to make a difference in 2020. What people thought is, oh, we can just be more conscious in terms of adjusting the sample to account for like the underrepresentation of white people with less than a college degree. We can be very attentive to that. Like we can be very attentive to like the regional composition. If you're polling within a state, and there are big differences between urban and rural areas, be really conscientious about ensuring that rural sample is not underrepresented in the data. Let's be really, really attentive to this. It's not just enough to take account of like race and sex and age. We need to take account of these other factors too. And I think people really tried hard in 2020, and yet still. I think most people think that it is a problem of non-response, meaning in pollster language, people either do not answer polls, like they just won't pick up the phone, or if they pick up the phone, they won't cooperate. They'll hang up. And we all do that ourselves, right? We don't take every poll that tries to poll us, right? But it seems to be somewhat asymmetric with respect to party. And that may mean that basically Republican candidates are going to end up, appearing as if they're going to do worse than they do. That was true, I think, in a lot of different, not every race, like not in Georgia in the November election, like, but it was true in Maine. So I think that even though there are states where you can say polls did relatively well, I think people are still pretty concerned. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't think we know what the answer is. There are task forces like who have to work on this kind of thing, after the election to try to figure it out. Whether that leads to biases in issue polling, the Pew Research Center just did an analysis of this, and the answer is it does a little bit, but not a ton. And the reason is that it's because the underrepresentation of, let's say Republican-leaning groups is, not massive. And then the relationship between, like, are you Republican or Democrat and how you feel about issues is present on many issues, but it's not perfect. And so on average, like a modest underrepresentation of Republicans doesn't have more than a small effect on the underrepresentation, let's say, of conservative views about issues. So I would not say that all issue polling is like systematically biased by an amount that we should all be concerned about. But I will say that, when it comes to predicting candidate elections, yeah, I'm going to be pretty cautious, even more cautious now than I was. And so in some sense, actually, the best way to do it, let me just say, if you have to if you have to live in the world, not in my world or Molly's world, where we're like political scientists, but if you live in the world like a normal person, and I would just say, assume that it's going to be the same way that it was last time. Okay. What's our best guess for the presidential election? Well, Clinton won by 2, Biden by 4. Okay. So someone's going to win by 2 or 4, or it's going to be really close. Like, just go to that outcome. Just, don't assume that the polls, it's going to be so much different than it was last time. Like, lowball that. Assume it's going to be tied until you know better, maybe.
I appreciate your encouragement, John, that people should live in normal people world, not the one that you and I dwell in on a daily basis. Next question is from Chris Moore, who is curious about looking at individuals who are unemployed or who had left the labor market. Do we know anything about how they voted compared to those who were not unemployed in 2020?
I don't know off the top of my head. It's it's not a large number of people if you think about the challenge of polling and, how many people who are unemployed or underemployed, depending on how you want to measure it, and it's going to show up in a typical sample. I will say this, for a long time, political scientists have looked at different ways of measuring economic insecurity, including just the literal fact of unemployment, which is an objective situation, as well as more subjective measures. And the effects of those things on your political beliefs are pretty underwhelming. So this is one reason why, for example, like having periods of American life with significant numbers of unemployed people, those unemployed people are not like the vanguard of some like proletarian, revolution that's going to bring about, a Danish style social welfare state. That typically hasn't happened. And when we looked at economic insecurity, in detail in 2016 and then followed it through into 2020, like you can see big shifts in economic insecurity. People, worried about like expenses and stuff like that, expressing like a degree of dissatisfaction or uncertainty. But you don't see like wholesale changes in public opinion as a consequence of that. You don't see, for example, sharply increasing number of people who favor, government programs of different kinds that would benefit people who are less wealthy, Medicare for all or those kinds of things. Most people supported like the stimulus packages and stuff like that, but that's kind of like, at least in April, that was a pretty March, that was a pretty universal sentiment, much less than a sentiment driven by people who were directly affected by it. So on balance, like I'm not suggesting that there's never going to be any political impact for an individual who experiences unemployment. I'm just saying that like on average, as we've looked over time and try to understand the relationship between economic circumstances and political beliefs, oftentimes those things are not tightly connected. And I guess the explanation for that is what I would say is this. Most of the time living our normal lives, we need help understanding how the things that happen to us, like what are the political implications of what happens to us in our life? Like if I have a relative that gets sick and gets cancer, and then the quality of healthcare that they receive is not good. Like, then what? Then what should I believe? Or what should change about my beliefs? Oftentimes what we need is we need political leaders, we need interest groups, we need other activists to sort of tell us like, well, what that means is that you should want healthcare system to change like this. And so sometimes we need kind of help. I mean, trying to figure out how our personal experiences have implications for politics, or what the implications for politics should be. And so that's maybe one reason why sometimes you don't see a quick and easy direct link between those experiences and our political beliefs.
All right, John, I have a couple more questions. The next one is from Elizabeth, who says, it's far too early to know, but do the data show anything about Trump's staying power over the National Republican Party?
Yeah. You mean like, are they going to hold a conservative conference in Washington, D.C. and take pictures in front of a golden statue of him? So here, I'll say a couple things. First of all, like, the Trump political apparatus, incompetent in a variety of ways, was relatively competent at putting loyalists in various positions in state and local political parties. So when you see like people like the Arizona State Republican Party freak out, and like start censuring Cindy McCain, and like all that stuff after the election and the insurrection and all of that, that's a reflection of the fact that like Kelly Ward is a Trump loyalist, like to her core, and she's been installed in that kind of role. So that's like, in that sense, like he's shaped the actual like party organization in some important ways until someone comes along and is able to sort of replace those people with other people. My sense is that a lot of Republicans, you have to look at what they do, and all those House Republicans that voted right that wouldn't certify the election, a handful of senators that wouldn't do that, fewer than initially, but still some. I mean, I think that I interpret them to perceive that there is much more downside to crossing Trump than there is upside at this point. And I think also, like, the other thing about Trump is that he didn't force the party to really rethink its stance on a lot of things. So if you think about Trump's views on guns, on abortion, on taxes, on government spending, on regulation, like Trump was not a lifelong Republican, as you all know. Like, he wasn't even a consistently conservative guy. He really wasn't consistently conservative when he ran for president in 2016, but he got on the right side of most issues. He didn't give the Republican Party too much to fear. To me, the big question is there still a moderate faction of the party that's willing to go up and advocate for immigration reform, as there was like in 2013? My fear is that Trump's made that much more difficult. And so in that sense, he's put a stamp on the party on that issue. He may also put a stamp on the party in terms of trade and sort of, economic policy in that domain. I can't quite tell. More generally, I think a lot of people are waiting for sort of the Republican Party to develop a policy agenda as opposed to like a grievance agenda. I mean, if your biggest concern right now is that like the estate of Dr. Seuss is not going to publish some racist Dr. Seuss books, like that's not really a policy agenda. Or if you're really mad at what college professors say, like as they seem to be periodically, like I can tell you right now that, I mean, most of my students are texting in class, so I'm not really having much success with the indoctrination campaign that I've been pursuing now for some 15 years. Or 18 years, sorry, I should remember how old I am. So I don't know. I mean, in that sense, the grievance stuff looks very consistent with Trump. It's a style of politics much more than it is a substance. But again, like I would be cautious, in part because y'all remember 2012 when the Republican Party said, "Golly, wow, man, we lost again. We gotta get on the right side of immigration. We got to appeal to Latinos and women and African Americans." Then Trump comes along and does the exact opposite of that, wins, and then Republican Party says, "Oh, I guess we don't have to do that." So it may be the case, though, that the next Republican candidate who comes along is not someone we would necessarily expect or necessarily anticipate will win. I don't know who that is. I'm not making predictions about that. But it could be that candidate is someone that can put a somewhat different stamp on the party. But again, they will face constraints in a landscape that has been remade at least to some extent by Trump. So I don't quite know how successful someone who wanted to really be a different politician than Trump how much success they would have. All right,
Thanks,
so there you go.
Sean. No, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to ask two last questions that are a little bit different. So I'm going to just pose them to you together, and you can respond how you like. One is from Ledley, who says, since we're gathered at church, he's wondering how faith informs your work as a political scientist, or how your work as a political scientist informs your faith. And the other one is from Nashville native Woody Turner, who wants to know, what's the whipsaw effect of going from blue state DC to red state Nashville?
Okay, so I think I can actually answer these to some extent in the same way. I mean, I grew up in North Carolina, and so to move to Tennessee is not like, I mean, in between North Carolina and Tennessee, I lived in Berkeley, California, Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C. So certainly I spent my time in liberal enclaves. But being back in Nashville is not, it's a little bit like I meet my uncle every day. It's kind of how I sometimes think about it, like, hi, nice to meet, real good people. But I would say like the differences are this, the visual representation of a politics that's different than most of Washington, D.C. is pretty evident all the time. From the yard signs to like the fact that there's a lot of gun stores, billboards for gun stores. Your children see the billboards for the gun stores. And just the fact that in the outlying areas around Nashville, especially, it gets pretty red pretty quickly, as opposed to Maryland, where it just takes a little longer to get, or Virginia takes a little longer to get out of the DC metro area, just from a driving standpoint. And so you're more conscious of the diversity of the country in that sense. And of course, living in Tennessee, which has pretty strongly Republican state politics, you're also trying to make your peace with the fact that like you're never gonna get much out of the state legislature or the governor that's going to make you happy. In fact, the state legislature right now is they're laser focused on making sure transgender kids don't play high school sports. Of all the things, right, we could be focused on right now. So, some of that I can anticipate, but some of it, growing up as I did, but some of it you'd have to kind of. But it's an opportunity for a conversation. This is now sort of slightly getting to Ledley's point. And I think Serena feels this as well, in her role. Like, this is there are church communities in Nashville that are still, in the Episcopal Church even, that are still quite conservative. There's one or two that are pretty St. Columbus-ish in their politics. And there's the church that she's at now, which is somewhere in between. And so, part of thinking about this is like, what's my witness, and how can I do that? If to the extent that I think about it as a political scientist, I think about like, what can I offer? What can I bring to these conversations that is maybe slightly enlightening, in the sense that I have some knowledge to share, but they can also guide the conversation in a more productive way. I don't know exactly how to do that in every context, because I don't want to be like lecturing people, or wearing my PhD a little too, heavily. But I do think we can do some things to help people understand the world. The other way I think about it, I guess, is like anybody, like I'm pissed off about things too, or I'm angry, or I'm sad. Like I was so sad when Trump went and stood in front of Lafayette, in Lafayette Square, in front of. I can't even talk about it. It was so upsetting. And then I was like, Bishop Marianne, go. Anyway, the point being, like I think about like I think faith sometimes like animates the questions that you ask, like, or kind of what you want to understand. And so like writing these books about these elections it's so terrible. It's so, like, because you have to remember all this crap that you just would not prefer to remember. Like I had to write a section, like in a chapter on this book on child separation at the border, and I had to go back and like go through like news articles and remind myself like what happened and how many kids and how many are still out there and they don't even know where they're supposed to go, and how, what were the effects of that on the kids. And like I was like, oh my God, I was just sitting there writing literally 2 paragraphs. That's it. Because it's, how much of the book can you devote to every one of these things that happen, right? But like I just thought like that's how I definitely feel feel the same feelings. It's just a question of like, can you channel that to like a productive kind of scientific inquiry so that, you know, you have answers that speak to things that are related to this. That's what maybe the way it works for me, Ledley, I guess. That doesn't mean that like if you were to go pick up one of my like academic journal articles and see like tables of statistics and graphs, you'd be like, that's clearly a Christian who wrote that, right? Like you would have no clue. But because it was just like ordinary old social science. But nevertheless, I think that to some extent, that's how those two worlds, you know, intersect for me. At least they have over the last several years, more perhaps than they did initially. But I suspect we all feel like that a little bit. You know, when times get tough, that seems like a very banal way to describe what's happened in the last several years. But when times get tough like this, you know, it forces you to reflect on these questions in a different way than you can when things were sort of more normal somehow. So I don't know. That's the best answer I can come up with in the moment.
Well, thank you so much, John. Chris Moore is going to close us in prayer. So Chris, if you want to come off mute and do that, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord, for spring. Thank you for our church community, which allows belief and faith to stand alongside with a focus on information and truth-telling. Be with us during this Lenten time of prayer, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, and help us to live God's love. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, John, for being with us. Joshua, do you have anything you want to say before we end?
No. Thank you so much, John and Chris. I will say that we have a couple of opportunities this afternoon. Amy is helping with a community prayer wall at St. Columba's, tying prayers in remembrance of healing and hope for this last year and the months coming ahead of us at St. Columba's from 5 to 6 today. And I'm leading a Zoom prayer session of prayers for healing and hope on this 1-year anniversary tonight at 7:30. Be great for you all to join us here or there as you are able.
Thank you, John.
Thank you all. Take care. I miss you.
Yeah.